2019. Thank you for your kind patience. We're about to start. My name is Mariam, a research associate from Ideas, and I will be your MC for today's event. As we count down to the year 2020, we come closer to reaching the midway point in realizing the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint 2025. In last year's Prosperity Initiative report, it was found that while ASEAN was making progress in achieving its targets set within the blueprint, it was falling behind on its self-imposed milestones. Today's conference provides a platform to not only reassess this issue, to see whether time loss has been compensated or it has continued to be delayed, but also to discuss key issues relating to ASEAN and Malaysia. To begin, I'd like to invite our Ideas Director of Research, Lawrence Todd, onto the stage to give his welcoming remarks. A warm applause.
Thank you very much. Yang Berhormat Dr. Ong Kiang Ming, Deputy Minister of International Trade and Industry, our distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. As has been said, my name is Lawrence Todd. I'm the Director of Research at Ideas. It's my great privilege to speak to you on this, which is our second annual forum for the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative. The ASEAN Prosperity Initiative is a program that Ideas launched last year, actually at our first forum in Singapore. So it's good to be back on home turf in Malaysia for our second publication. So the purpose of the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative is to try to identify strategic challenges faced by ASEAN, particularly those that are relevant to Malaysia, so that Malaysian think tanks have their voice heard at the ASEAN level. We know, of course, that discussions and issues at the ASEAN level bear very significantly on Malaysia, and we want to ensure, as part of Malaysian civil society, that we are there in those discussions. So the flagship project under the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative is our AEC scorecard, where we try to track the implementation of the measures designed to realize the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint, which is scheduled for realization by the year 2025. So today we will be publishing our second scorecard, which measures the level of implementation. But I'm pleased to say that also at today's forum, we have an opportunity for two other publications. First, where's the, do I have the clicker? I don't have the clicker. In which case, can we just go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm glad to say that we have two other reports today. First of all, I'm very privileged that we will also be hosting the launch of a book which has been edited by our esteemed fellow, Dr. Jayant Menon, who is lead economist at the Asia Development Bank. This is a book that takes a much broader perspective of ASEAN, looking back over the last 50 years and where ASEAN stands in its current trajectory towards integration. The clicker is behind, sorry, my mistake. The clicker is behind, but it doesn't seem to work, so forgive me for that. And then thirdly, we have a third report today, which is a joint report by 6 ASEAN think tanks, led by a partner organization of ours, the Geneva Network, which looks at the status of intellectual property rights within ASEAN. Now, this is very important to us because we hear much discussion of ASEAN's need to move up the value chain and develop new, more competitive industries, and we often talk about the need to develop a knowledge economy within ASEAN. But key to that is a framework of intellectual property rights that provides the space for innovation and reform. So we're pleased that we'll also be launching and discussing the current status of intellectual property rights in ASEAN as detailed in the report from our partner, the Geneva Network. So to begin, I will be handing over to my colleague Azam, who will detail the report that Ideas has led on, which is the ASEAN Economic Community Scorecard. So Azam, if you would please come to the stage. But we just need to make sure that the clicker works, because at the moment it does not. Come. Okay. No, so I think we'll just have to, you have to ask for the next slide to go through. Okay. So with that, I will hand over to Azam, who's going to talk through the kind of centerpiece research of the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Lawrence. My name is Azam. I'm a researcher at Ideas, and I've been working with Lawrence throughout this project. Can I just get the next slide, please? So from our research during this project, we realized that there is quite a disconnect from the business community and from the general public in their understanding and knowledge of the AEC and the AEC blueprints. So hopefully by the end of this presentation and upon reading the report, you'll have a better understanding of why that may be the case. So the ASEAN Economic Community is a culmination of various efforts for integration since the birth of ASEAN in 1967. These efforts include the ASEAN Preferential Trading Agreement implemented in 1977, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement in 1993, the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services in 1995, and then following in 2003, the ASEAN member states finally decided that it was time to create an ASEAN community. The AEC is a dynamic and evolving concept, and there are two primary documents that plan out the vision of the AEC and the implementation of economic integration. And this is the AEC 2015 blueprint and the AEC 2025 blueprint. So the first pillar of the ASEAN Economic Community 2015 blueprint seeks to achieve a single market and production base through the free flow of goods, services, investment, and capital. This priority for economic liberalization is again reflected within the AEC 2025 blueprint, which aims to enhance ASEAN's trade and production networks and establish a unified market. Next slide, please. Under the previous AEC Blueprint 2015, the ASEAN Secretariat produced these scorecards to track the implementation of the measures required to implement the AEC 2015 Blueprint, as well as to comment on the compliance of different member states. However, under the current AEC 2025 Blueprint, the ASEAN Secretariat is not planning to produce these scorecards. Instead, they have an integration monitoring office, which has prepared a monitoring and evaluation framework to assess the progress. And although we welcome the efforts of the ASEAN Secretariat in developing more sophisticated and reliable tools to measure the implementation of the AEC Blueprint 2025, as Lawrence has noted, we also believe that transparency and inclusivity within the assessment is an important factor. So this project aims to do just that. In order to do this, we have made a monitoring and assessment tool of the implementation of the Consolidated Strategic Action Plan, or CSAP, which is a document with specific action points for AEC implementation. We've also adopted a similar method to the discontinued AEC scorecard of identifying the number of measures which have been successfully implemented, which we collected through a combination of both primary and secondary data collection. Next slides, please. In this graph, you'll see the summary of our findings. So expanding on the evaluation methods, we looked into each action line and gave a score of complete if there's evidence that the action has been fully implemented, or partial if the action is partially or ongoing. Overdue if there's evidence that the action hasn't met a deadline that was specified within the Consolidated Strategic Action Plan. And no evidence if we couldn't find any public evidence to reach any of the other previously announced conclusions. So after going through the total 647 action lines within the Consolidated Action Plan against our methodology, we found that Over 50% of the action lines are either fully or partially implemented, while only 17.7% have been fully implemented. Next slide, please. So overall, we found the highest rate of fully implemented actions in the third characteristic of the blueprint, which is to enhance connectivity and sectoral cooperation, with 22% of the action lines within that characteristic showing full implementation at the time of our research. Amongst the 5 characteristics, perhaps the most important to intra-regional trade and economic integration is to create a highly integrated and cohesive economy, the first pillar, which shows the highest rate of overdue actions. So as many of the 117 action lines within this characteristics were due in 2018, and they were shown to be overdue in their implementation. But we find that overall, considering the 2 years since the adoption of the CSAP in 2017, the progress of implementation has been somewhat positive. However, it's clear that fully implemented action lines remain to be relatively low. So how has this AEC implementation rate led to the economic integration on the ground? When we look at, sorry, next slides, please. Right there, perfect. So we look at conventional indicators of economic integration. First, we look at the intra-ASEAN trade in goods. We found that the total trade in goods between ASEAN and the rest of the world has increased over time. However, the rate of intra-ASEAN trade has remained relatively stagnant. In the first quarter of 2018, there was a total of almost $700 billion in trade, and 23.5% of that total trade was within ASEAN member states, which has shown a slight recovery, but this is more likely to be a cause of declining global trade volumes due to the US-China trade war, rather than a natural increase in intra-ASEAN trade intensity. Next slide, please. In intra-ASEAN trade and services, we see a similar situation. So with $700 billion of trade and services in 2017, only 16.5% of that $700 billion occurred within the region. And this has been showing a rather stagnant or unchanged rate amidst growing total trade in services between ASEAN and the rest of the world. Next slide, please. Then we look at investments, in particular intra-ASEAN investments, and from which countries they came from. Throughout the years, we see that the flows of inward FDI between ASEAN members continuously are sourced from the same 6 countries, which are Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. This totals to $24.5 billion in 2018, and Singapore continues to dominate as a source of intra-ASEAN FDI at consistently over 70% over the years. Next slide, please. When we look at investment among ASEAN members, particularly where the investments had gone in terms of industry, we see an increasing flow towards the manufacturing and services sector, with a substitution away from the primary and other sectors. Next slide, please. So the broad trend of previous years has continued with absolute growth in trade and investment, but intra-ASEAN shares remaining stable and broadly unchanged. Whether or not this can be interpreted as a success or not depends on the perceived goals of ASEAN and the AEC. So has the AEC been successful in achieving the economic integration it envisions? When looking at the AEC 2015 and the AEC 2025 blueprint, their first pillar of economic integration sets a primary goal, particularly in growing ASEAN into a production base and single market. The success of AEC should therefore not be measured in terms of the growth of intra-ASEAN trade, but rather through the greater participation of ASEAN member states individually and collectively in the global economy. So this can be measured through their integration into global value chains, as described in Invest ASEAN. ASEAN's continued efforts to multilaterally liberalize beyond the region have boosted the benefits that the countries can derive from GVCs through access to competitive inputs. And member states have participated in both, as both importers of foreign goods, which then they use in production, which is called backwards participation, and as producers and exporters of intermediate goods, which are then incorporated into the production of other countries. This is considered forward participation in GVCs. So through looking at the backwards and forward participation, we can see the growth trend in total GVC participation in ASEAN countries. The emergence of the ASEAN Economic Community in 2003 has coincided with an observable acceleration of overall GVC participation. This has been a result of an evolving process of deepened economic integration within the ASEAN and enhanced connectivity through the country's investments in hard and soft infrastructure. Although there is a clear divergence between members, with Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam remaining at the bottom end of the intensity of participation within the global value chain. Vietnam has been somewhat of an exception to the laggard states as it pushes towards greater foreign value added within their exports. So in other words, it can be argued that the success of the AEC and the goal of making ASEAN into a production base has been evident in the growth of the ASEAN member states' growing GVC participation. If not overall, at least amongst the ASEAN 6. However, the increasing divergence of ASEAN countries' participation in GVCs highlights how some ASEAN states, particularly the lagging countries, are not integrating as rapidly or extensively into GVCs. Next slide, please. In addition to the goal of developing ASEAN as a single production base is also the objective to develop ASEAN as a single market. So this goal, more than the push for a production base, can be justified in terms of intra-ASEAN cross-border economic activity. And as a single market should be characterized by businesses of one ASEAN member state exporting goods and services seamlessly to the market of another. ASEAN leaders have set the ambitious target of doubling the share of intra-ASEAN trade by 2025, which is a goal that clearly reflects the ambition to develop a single market. As noted previously, however, in the previous graphs, the growth of intra-ASEAN trade is on par or slower in trade between ASEAN and the rest of the world. Further analysis of the levels of intra-ASEAN trade intensity reveals the divergence between member states in realizing a single market, characterized by growth in intra-regional trade intensity. So although ASEAN 4 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand, have maintained trade intensity with the ASEAN region, since 2008, there has been a significant decline in trade intensity between the ASEAN 4 and the laggard countries. This shift away from trade with other ASEAN partners could be explained by a substitution with China as a partner, as shown by the gradual increase in trade intensity with China over the same period. So consideration needs to be given to kind of underlying characteristics as to why this happened, such as the competitive versus complementary nature of ASEAN economies, which would determine the extent to which countries have a basis for trade even after all barriers are removed. So this slide shows that trade complementarity between the laggard states and the ASEAN 6. Trade complementarity is an indicator of the bilateral trade opportunities between countries. High trade complementarity means that there's an opportunity for growth if partners intensify trade relationships. And the effect of having a high trade complementarity can result in greater intra-regional trade intensity between country groups. So the trade complementarity between ASEAN nations reinforce kind of this larger picture of divergence between laggard countries and the ASEAN 6. ASEAN 4 countries with moderately strong trade complementarity have continued to maintain their trade intensity with one another, even during external economic shocks like the 2008 financial crisis. In contrast, the lagging countries, which all have a low trade complementarity of 0.08, have shown a significant decreasing trend in intra-regional trade intensity caused by, again, the trade substitution with other trade partners. These countries which continually turn to extra-regional partners are especially vulnerable to external shocks that disrupt global trade flows. This divergence of trade complementarity, can we go back? So the divergence of trade complementarity with ASEAN is stark when compared to the other major trading bloc, the European Union. In 1990 to 1994, the 4 Central and Eastern European countries that later joined the EU had significantly higher trade complementarity, which suggests that there's an underlying economic logic that was more in favor of regional integration. Next slide, please. So what's the bottom line of all this? It's that ASEAN is succeeding as a production base, which has been supported by the efforts of the AEC, but that we see that there is a divergence between member states. The progress with realizing a true single market, which is characterized by higher levels of intra-ASEAN trade and investments, has been successful, but achieving a production base, it's been more successful than achieving a production base. And this has been driven in part by underlying economic divergence. Next slides, please. So how does the business community think of the AEC? There was a survey conducted by the EU ASEAN Business Council in 2019, which shows the sentiments of the business community. This slide shows when asked if they think that the AEC is occurring fast enough, only 3% said yes. Next slide, please. And when asked if ASEAN had achieved a single market and production base, almost all respondents had either answered no or that it was only occurring partially. These stark findings might suggest that the areas in which the AEC is making slow progress are in the areas most important to businesses. In terms of the actions relating to customs, trade facilitation, standards, technical regulations, and conformity assessment procedures, only one action line has been fully implemented. A number of other important areas often cited by multinational companies are also progressing more slowly. For example, for actions relating to intellectual property, we judge that only 22.2% of the measures are even partially implemented, with none being fully implemented. We will hear a lot more about this in the evening presentation by the Geneva Network. Next. The other possible explanation for the poor assessment of the AEC is that the level of ambition falls short of what is actually required to achieve meaningful progress. A number of the measures included in the AEC blueprint are framed in a way that allows for different interpretations or doesn't specify a significant change in policy. You could argue that the action words such as implement, establish, and adopt, one of the most used words are actions are specific, while other most commonly used verbs would be associated with kind of less impactful actions and could be interpreted more broadly. So as a result, a relatively strong performance in the implementation of weaker actions might not result in policy impact on the ground. For further analysis, we created a scoring method to analyze the relative importance and institutional significance of the different measures in the blueprint, whether on the partial implemented actions included a detailed guideline as well as a monitoring entity to monitor the progress, or whether the partial implementation had simply entailed hosting a meeting. We found that over 50% of the partially implemented actions were somewhere in between these two, where the action is accompanied by a framework or a guideline, but there doesn't seem to be an implementing or monitoring entity to implement the action line being promised. So the bottom line of all this is basically you can't escape from the fact that the perception from the business and the private community of the AEC is rather poor. And this can be explained by the lack of progress in priority areas for businesses and possibly by the relative weakness of the CSAP measures themselves. The three main takeaways from our research, I would say, the first, that 2 years since the Consolidated Strategic Action Plan to implement the ASEAN Economic Community, more than half of the total 647 action lines have been fully or partially implemented. However, we judge that only 17.7% have been fully implemented, less than 1 out of 5. Conclusion number 2 is that ASEAN member states have become significantly more integrated into global value chains, which suggests that the AEC has been successful in developing ASEAN as a production base. However, the progress towards a single market, which is usually characterized by higher levels of intra-ASEAN trade, as well as investments, is progressing more slowly, partly due to the underlying lack of complementarity between ASEAN member states. The final conclusion is that the perception of the ASEAN Economic Community remains quite negative, despite some evidence of success, which may reflect the failure to achieve progress in the most important areas and the relative weakness of the actions themselves. So we recommend that the ASEAN member states prioritize implementation in the areas which have the biggest impact on the ground. So to wrap this all up, we have created a website that provides all of the detailed scores and explanations of our assessment. And you can head to the IDEAS website for the full report. I believe you can grab them outside as well. I think we have a very exciting forum today, and I look forward to the panel discussion ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Azam, for that illuminating and very informative presentation. As we have laid the foundation of our panel discussions today, moving forward, I'd like to add on to that by inviting Dr. Jayan Menon, the lead economist from ASEAN Development Bank, to do a presentation on an evolving ASEAN vision and reality. Prior to his current role in ADB, Dr. Jayan was an academic mainly at the Center of Policy Studies at Monash University in Melbourne for more than a decade. He holds adjunct appointments with the Australian National University of Canberra, University of Nottingham, England, as well as IDEAS. Dr. Jayan has authored and co-authored more than 100 academic publications focusing on trade and development in relations to ASEAN. His work in ADB currently focuses on the same matters with the addition of international investment as well. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Jayan Menon.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Yang Berhormat, Dr. Ong, Deputy Trade Minister, Mr. Ali Salman, Executive Director of IDEAS, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here today to participate in this triple launch. We've had one already. I will be doing the second. And that's in relation to this book that all of you will have a free copy of in your package. It's also online, so please tell your friends if they want to read it. They can go to the ADB website and find it there as well. Next slide, please. Now, this book my presentation, I guess, today will cover these issues very briefly. Now, I can't see my slides on this computer, I'm afraid, if they can come back with this. But this is how I will basically organize my presentation. I'll say a little bit about the background to this project, look at the individual chapters, summarizing them very quickly. Then I'll move on to some key takeaways from the volume, and then present some questions for the panel to consider a bit later on. Next slide, please. So, this project was born out of an idea from Dr. Narongchai, who was a former Minister of Commerce in Thailand, and one of the original researchers on the ASEAN idea. He was an academic at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, or ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, almost 50 years ago, when he and a number of others started trying to provide the intellectual basis for the ASEAN project. Now, he approached ADB, at that time my boss, Iwan Aziz, to try and gather together a lot of these original thinkers about ASEAN, to get them to reflect on their original visions and to think about how that vision has or has not been realized over this long period of history of almost 50 years. And to also say a little bit about where we should go from here onwards. So how should ASEAN evolve into the future to address the various challenges it needs to face? So next slide. So these are basically the three general questions we asked the paper writers to consider, right? The original motivations, have those motivations changed over time, and the extent to which they've been realized, and how they should be adjusted moving forward. Next slide. Okay, so very quickly, let me run through a short summary of each of the chapters in the book. The first chapter is by Emil Salim, a distinguished Indonesian academic and policymaker, advising many Indonesian presidents. There haven't been very many, but he advised all of them. And he basically looks at the domestic factors that influenced ASEAN's formation, and also the geopolitical context. At that time, a rather troubling geopolitical situation taking place in the region. And he also looks at how the +3 countries, China, Japan, and Korea, affects ASEAN's role and how this interacts with ASEAN's function in the region. Now, this is not surprising. Indonesia is clearly the largest player within ASEAN, but Indonesia usually doesn't want to be the spokesperson for ASEAN. So he also considers this question, who should speak for ASEAN? And whether everyone speaks for ASEAN and therefore nobody speaks for ASEAN. So this is a difficult situation, but one that needs to be addressed, and his ideas are interesting on that topic. The next chapter is by Ambassador Delia Albert. Again, Delia, like Mr. Salim, was involved right from the start in playing a critical role in terms of designing ASEAN's functions in the foreign affairs area mainly. And she looks at how the various bilateral meetings played their part in ASEAN's foundation, and also looks at how personal relationships were critical in sort of forming ASEAN and building the trust at the early stages of cooperation. Next, please. The third chapter is by Rodolfo Severino, and he looks here at the multifaceted nature of ASEAN, and as a former ASEAN Secretary General, he provides an interesting insider's perspective on the process of ASEAN community building. He also looks at the various different aspects of ASEAN cooperation, not just economic, but also going back to its original function as a political security grouping, and also more recently the social cultural aspects. The fourth chapter is by another insider, Dr. Sutad Setbunsang, who's a former Deputy Secretary of ASEAN, and this is the first and only father-son chapter. And Sutad, with his son, explores how ASEAN cooperation has been shaped by external developments and the extent to which they have improved or affected negatively the evolution of ASEAN. And as a former insider, he also talks a bit about the institutional mechanisms that have affected ASEAN cooperation. Next, please. Professor Chia Xiao Yu is our Singaporean representative in this volume, and she looks at Singapore's pursuit of open regionalism and how that has supported ASEAN's regionalism. And she looks at how we can further deepen economic integration in ASEAN, and talks about how Singapore in particular has been trying to hasten the pace of this deepening and to try and drag ASEAN along as Singapore pursues various bilateral free trade agreements with its key trading partners. Next is the chapter by Tham Siu Yen. Now I have to be a bit careful here because she's present in the audience and will be on the panel a bit later. Siu Yen is our Malaysian representative and talks about how national interests have influenced Malaysia's priorities for ASEAN cooperation. I'm sure all of you will want to read her chapter if you're going to read only one chapter. And also, Siu Yen reflects on how the future of ASEAN and Malaysia's economic policies may interact going forward. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about that later. Finally, Florian Alburo from the Philippines looks at how the ASEAN economic agreements have been evolving, the extent to which they become more sophisticated. And also, he looks at an issue that we look at quite closely in the previous report, the report that was just presented, this relationship between the single market versus production base. So that's a quick summary of the chapters of the book, and I hope you'll take some time to look at the book that you have and read more carefully the ones that you are interested in. Now let me now turn to the key messages that come out of this report. And this is my personal view, and in fact all that I say today is personal and should not be taken to reflect ADB's position. Now I think it's important to start off with to recognize that ASEAN is the most successful grouping amongst those of the developing world. We have an alphabet soup of development organizations and trade organizations, and many of them are renowned for doing nothing. ASEAN has survived more than 50 years, and despite everything people say about the ASEAN way, the slowness, the consensus building, it is still there today and is still going strong. So let's recognize that to begin with before we start complaining about everything it hasn't been able to do. So ASEAN has also been born in a difficult time in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. In fact, it was still going on. And it has grown from being a political security organization to dealing with a lot of other issues, especially in the economic arena, right? And it has seen rapid economic development of all of its members, reducing poverty sharply and improving living standards over the years. Now, this is a good background to ASEAN, and we have to ask if now it is equipped to deal with the key challenges going forward. Next, please. Okay, I think one of the first challenges is balancing political and economic objectives, right? I've just mentioned that it was born in a turbulent period, and it was designed mainly to try and keep the peace. Now this ASEAN has done very well, and maybe we don't give enough credit to this achievement, right? One reason could be that achieving this objective means that nothing happens, right? Peace is boring, right? When you have peace, you can forget that you have it because it's achieved by the fact that we don't notice it. Everything is nice and quiet. But peace is also critical to economic achievements. You cannot pursue your economic objectives unless you also secure peace. And this has happened, and ASEAN has played its role. But it must balance political, socio-economic, and strategic issues with the economic, as various geopolitical challenges increase in importance. We've heard about the territorial disputes involving the waters around this region, and now we have the trade war as well. And ASEAN must withstand those pressures and continue to balance both the non-economic with the economic. Next, please. The next challenge, and this relates to what Azam presented just before this, and that is to strengthen the implementation of the ASEAN Economic Community, or the AEC, right? We've heard already how both the scope and sophistication of ASEAN's agenda, economic agenda, has increased. Now, is ASEAN up to the challenge? Some people are concerned that the ratcheting or the rhetoric to keep up with all the other agreements has gone beyond ASEAN's capabilities, right? That's one view. Others see a lot of potential for ASEAN to step up to this challenge and realize the objectives in the economic integration arena. But the early phase of that integration is over. All the low-hanging fruit have been plucked. What's left now are the much more difficult areas of reform. The non-tariff barriers, the issues dealing with intellectual property, which we'll hear about later on also today, and many other areas in the services and the investment arena. So ASEAN will have to strengthen its implementation if it's to realize these objectives. Next, please. Okay. Uh, Another, I think, challenge going forward is balancing global, regional, and national interests. I think one way to look at ASEAN and the AEC is that it provides the opportunity for countries to pursue national reforms, right? At the end of the day, it's national interests that would really determine what ASEAN can and cannot achieve. I like to say that ASEAN is all about the carrot because there is no stick, right? So it's all about goodwill, right? And that is by design. ASEAN's approach is to build consensus, to bring everyone together, and to move forward as fast as the slowest member will allow. That has its pluses and minuses, but certainly it ensures that we will never have a Brexit type situation. But it needs to balance various global, regional, and national interests. And it needs to make sure that the flexibility that it so endears in keeping it all together doesn't impinge too much on progress. So that is the balancing act, I think, for ASEAN, especially going forward. Next, please. And related to that is strengthening ASEAN's institutions. Some commentators complain about the lack of institutional deepening. Some are obsessed with working out why the ASEAN Secretariat is so weak. I think the ASEAN Secretariat is weak by design, right? ASEAN doesn't want a strong supranational body because it's not ready, unlike the Europeans, to give up sovereignty to a third party. But as its agenda becomes more sophisticated and as it tries to pursue deeper integration, it needs to move somewhat in that direction, but of course not fully. When ASEAN talks about its economic community, it's not talking about what the Europeans are pursuing. It has its own version of it, and it's nowhere near as demanding as a European model. Nevertheless, it needs to strengthen its institutions. It needs to allow its secretariat to be better equipped, both financially and in terms of human capital, to carry out the growing agenda, right? So reforming its institutions and governing bodies is a challenge, is another challenge going forward. Next, please. Now, finally, all of this can only happen if trust amongst the member countries increases, right? And this is where I think we need to think about what ASEAN is really trying to achieve in this integration project. How deep it wants to go will depend on how much it is willing to give up to a supranational body. And if it's only willing to give up a small amount, then we have to adjust our expectations accordingly. But if it's willing to give up a lot more, that can only happen with greater trust amongst its member countries. Now, let me stop there in terms of the key messages that I want to offer from the book, and finish off by talking about the late Ambassador Rod Severino, to whom this book is dedicated. Rod was a contributor to the volume, and more than that, he was a key player in the design and the workings of the volume in its production. And Rod was also a former ambassador of the Philippines to Malaysia from 1989 to 2002. So he's also an old friend of Malaysia, and we remember him in this volume today and always and thank him for his contribution to ASEAN as a former Secretary General, as well as to his relationship building with the Philippines as Ambassador to Malaysia. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to listening from you and receiving your questions during the panel session a bit later on. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Jayan, for that wonderful and informative presentation. Next, it is my privilege and honor to invite Yang Berhormat Dr. Ong Kian Ming, Deputy Minister of International Trade and Industry Malaysia, to give his keynote address.
Thank you very much, MC. And to Ali, CEO of Ideas, thanks so much for adjusting your time today so that I can attend and share a few thoughts, especially in terms of the homework that you've given me to read through the ASEAN integration report, which I've done yesterday. This is the soft copy. This is the unbounded version, and I was just given another 2 reports, including one edited volume by Jayant, dedicated to the former Secretary General of ASEAN. So more homework for me to do, which is a good thing, because I think this is a testament of the good work that Ideas has done in terms of the research, pushing for the research agenda, not just among think tanks here in Malaysia, but also regionally, to develop ideas about what the market economy means, what ASEAN as a whole should strive for, and some of the areas in which there's probably a lot more work that we can do in order to see the ideals of ASEAN achieved. I just want to take this opportunity to congratulate the authors of the ASEAN Integration Report, and also the other 2 reports that will be launched here today. Of course, I pay more attention to the ASEAN Integration Report because, firstly, this is the one I've read. Secondly, it touches on many of the issues that have to do with trade and investment, which are very important to my ministry. And I think, this is, and thirdly, this is part and parcel of an ongoing exercise that the authors and also Ideas is committed to under the ASEAN Prosperity Initiative. So this is the second volume, second edition of the report, and I'm sure that as each edition rolls out year after year, there will be sort of like scorecards in which we can keep track of in terms of what ASEAN has or has not done. The first, I'd like to make 3 points with regards to some of the content of this report. The first is to say that this report card reminds me of what Ideas did in terms of the Pakatan Harapan Manifesto 1 year after we were in power. And I think this kind of accountability is very useful. This kind of accountability, I think, is good for all the member countries in ASEAN, which is why I think it's good that after Malaysia, I understand that Ideas will also be going to Bangkok to have another discussion session to increase the number of stakeholders who know about this. And I also understand that as part of the preparation of this report, Ideas and the authors also went to Jakarta, went to Singapore, was in Thailand, as well as, of course, being here in Malaysia in order to consult the relevant stakeholders on some of the issues that are important in terms of ASEAN integration, and also the issues that were highlighted in this ASEAN integration report. So I think this report card, continues to be a very important reference point for all of us who are monitoring the progress that ASEAN makes as ASEAN inches along on a very gradual basis. And I'm sure that all of you here who are working on ASEAN-related matters would know. Jayan talked about the consensus approach by which ASEAN moves, so that we move as fast as the slowest member. And I think this is one of the things which is one of the advantages of ASEAN, as well as being one of the frustrating things about ASEAN as well. So, in terms of putting together all the relevant information in this report, I think that the ideas needs to be applauded. And for those of you who perhaps are not familiar with some of the plans or programs or implementation policies that have to do with the fulfillment of the ASEAN Economic Community 2025, I'd encourage you to read the quarterly updates for the Consolidated Strategic Action Plan. And this is something that's relatively new under ASEAN, to give a quarterly update on some of the initiatives that have been rolled out under ASEAN in order to achieve this economic community by 2025. I think that's, it's an important reference point in terms of the documents which ASEAN has produced for public consumption. Yeah. A couple of things that I also want to make note of with regards to this report. There were a couple of indicators on the scorecard which caught me a little bit by surprise, that there has been no evidence or very little evidence of progress. Of course, when we see the overall report, I'm glad to see that there are some parts that are already in red, meaning they are already being fulfilled. There's about another 30% that are in progress. But also, a large part, more than 40% that where we see little evidence of progress. And two particular indicators caught my attention in terms of no evidence. And this is firstly, movement of skilled labor and also business visitors. 100% no evidence of progress on this area. And the other area of 100% no evidence is in the area of good governance. I think I highlight these two areas because these are two areas which I think are very important to Malaysia. Especially under the new government, we've undertaken a number of initiatives in order to push for good governance within Malaysia. And I think some of these experiences can also be shared, and hopefully the agenda on good governance can be pushed slowly but surely among ASEAN member countries. In terms of movement of skilled labor and business visitors, I think this is one area which is going to be and is already very important in terms of cross-border movement of workers within ASEAN, especially on the skilled level front. And I think this is increasingly important, linked to the third point that I'll talk about in terms of taking advantage of the US-China conflict, whereby it's much more important, I think, for us to have plans in order to make it easier for skilled labor within ASEAN to move from one country to another to work on related projects that are part and parcel of the deepening of integration within ASEAN countries. Another area which is not 100% no evidence, but 80% no evidence. I think 10% of these initiatives were implemented, 10% still in progress, 80% no evidence is in the line items concerning sustainable development. And I think this is, of course, something that is very important, not just in terms of looking at how member countries can push forward the agenda of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are even now being discussed as part of the UN General Assembly in New York. And of course, many of us would have seen the viral clip of this young Norwegian teenager, Gunther, of how she has called out many world leaders, many people who are older than herself in terms of their commitment towards sustainable development. I think this is one area where ASEAN can also push forth, perhaps in a more sustained and also more targeted manner. And in terms of sustainable development, I'm sure that all of us have been quote-unquote victims of unsustainable development with regards to some of the environmental concerns that we've had here in Malaysia over the haze issue over the past 3 weeks. And I'm glad that it's cleared up, but moving forward, I think there is and there should be much more attention paid to this particular area. The second issue that I want to bring up is with regards to some of the initiatives that have been undertaken at the ASEAN level, maybe away from public attention, in terms of deeper integration, especially from a digital economy or e-commerce perspective, as well as from the removal or the attempt to reduce non-tariff measures and barriers. In terms of e-commerce, this is something that I'm not sure how many of you are aware of. ASEAN actually signed an agreement on e-commerce earlier this year, and this was following some of the aggressive push for more digital economy initiatives when Singapore held the chairmanship of ASEAN last year. And part and parcel of the ASEAN agreement on e-commerce is streamlining regional trade rules, which will hopefully promote lower operating barriers in terms of entry for business. And I think this would definitely mean freer movement of e-commerce goods across Southeast Asia, and this would also increase cross-border trade in goods and services between ASEAN member countries, and which would obviously increase intra-ASEAN trade. So increase the potential to increase the level of intra-ASEAN trade beyond the 23% that we saw just now. Hopefully beyond even the 25% mark. I think this is something that would be very useful for ASEAN. And this is also part and parcel of how we want to continue to push for greater initiatives in the e-commerce and digital economy space, not just within ASEAN. It's also an area that we're discussing very rigorously within the context of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and then also will feature prominently in our agenda for APEC 2020, which Malaysia is hosting next year. The issue of non-trade barriers and measures, I think, is one of the things which has been highlighted by many, many people. People who deal with ASEAN, people who have to trade within and between ASEAN, highlighting the increase in the number of NTMs as well as NTBs over time. Of course, over the years, Malaysia has also actively voiced our concerns over this, the increase in the number of NTMs and NTBs across ASEAN countries. And we have used various platforms in ASEAN, whether it's the ASEAN Summit, the ASEAN Economic Ministers Meeting, or the ASEAN Economic Officials Meetings on measures and trade facilitation initiatives that are needed to curb and also further reduce NTMs and NTBs. Just to give you two examples, two of the key components that Malaysia has always emphasized in influencing the smooth flow of trade in ASEAN are transparency and also the harmonization of standards and regulations. At the 49th ASEAN Economic Ministers Meeting in Manila in September 2017, Malaysia's proposals on measures to address the NTM and NTBs were agreed upon by the other ASEAN countries. And we suggested the need for clear guidelines to be established as the basis for categorizing NTBs and NTMs, and the full implementation of the commitment and notification procedures under the ATIGA agreement, or the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. So this is part and parcel of how we're trying to push the agenda forward. This was back in 2017, and for 2018, at the 50th ASEAN Economic Ministers Meeting in Singapore, this meeting approved the guidelines for the implementation of the ASEAN Commitment on Non-Tariff Measures on Goods. Of course, when we talk about commitment, I think the question that the authors would continue to ask is to what degree this will be translated into actual implementation measures. And we do take note of that. Currently, all AMS are in the process of organizing their respective domestic practice in order to develop a work plan to implement the principles stated in the said guidelines. So, there are implementation goals and guidelines that we need to adhere to or follow through at the ASEAN level. And in addition, at the regional level, ASEAN has taken various initiatives to address NTMs and NTBs. And I'll just give you a few examples. These are a little bit more technical, but I think it's good to be able to give you a flavor of some of the activities and meetings that have been convened in order to address the NTMs and NTBs issues. The first is the reactivation of the ASEAN Trade Facilitation Joint Consultative Committee, ATF-JCC, in 2015. The ATF-JCC collaborates with the private sector in identifying, reducing, and eliminating NTM and NTBs, including developing the ASEAN NTM guidelines. Secondly, establish the ASEAN Solutions for Investment, Services and Trade, or ASSIST platform in 2015, which provides an online consultation session to address issues faced by the business community in cross-border trade related to the implementation of ASEAN economic agreements. Thirdly, accelerate the standardization and compliance processes. This is in terms of standards and conformance and varying technical requirements among ASEAN member countries through the Mutual Recognition Agreement. This, again, is a little bit technical, but basically what we want to try to achieve is that if one particular good is certified under, for example, SIRIM standards here in Malaysia, it should have some sort of a recognition from other certifying bodies in other member ASEAN countries as well. Easier said than done, but this is one area that we've identified. Developing the ASEAN Trade Repository, ATR, since 2015, which serves as a one-stop center for providing information on trade-related laws and customs procedures for ASEAN countries. Fifthly, the implementation of the ASEAN Single Window System, which enables interactive and online exchange of documents and trading data for more efficient and seamless export and import transactions. We've implemented this already for not all ASEAN countries, but for some ASEAN countries that feel that they are, they are ready to implement this ASEAN single window. I believe that there are 5 countries that have already implemented this system, and we are in the process of fine-tuning it and hopefully expanding it to other countries. 6, implement the ASEAN-wide self-certification scheme, AWSC, which allows exporters and manufacturers to self-certify their certificate of origin. This is an ongoing process. 7th, establish the ASEAN Customs Transit System, where custom transit management is carried out through computer systems to enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of transit procedures. And then 8th, which is the last one, the establishment of NTM databases in the ASEAN region through an online system jointly established by the ASEAN Secretariat in collaboration with AREA, the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and Southeast and East Asia, and ARISE, the ASEAN Regional Integration Support, which is an agency that is supported by the EU, in accordance with the Strategic Action Plan AEC Trade Facilitation 2025. So this is, some of these are technical areas where we have ongoing discussions and also implementation plans. And I'm glad that Encik Zahid, Senior Director for ASEAN from MITI, is here to be able to give you more details during the panel session. So he has to do the hard work, I just say some of these things. The last point that I want to make is perhaps one that's more speculative, one that perhaps is more provocative in terms of in terms of one particular aspect of this report. And the idea that I want to throw out there to you to think about, to reflect on, is the issue of the US-China conflict. And I think most of us would agree in this room that the US-China conflict is an issue that would not subside anytime soon. Even if, let's say, there are, sort of like a détente or temporary peace, so to speak, in terms of finding some short-term resolutions to the tariff issues, I think we can see that the writing is on the wall in terms of other conflict areas, including, for example, technology conflict, as seen in the position which the US has taken against Huawei, for example. Right. So given the fact that this conflict is likely to continue, what would be the effect in terms of ASEAN integration? And I want to propose this speculative thought, or this, this hypothesis, that perhaps the US-China conflict may be a possible catalyst which can increase intra-ASEAN trade and investment. So that's my hypothesis. And I picked out these 2 lines in the report, which perhaps hints at this possibility. And let me quote from the report so that I don't get this wrong. In reference to the US-China trade war, while this is likely to reduce the extent of the trade relationship with China, this is with regards to the US, it is not certain that it will be replaced by growing relations with an internal ASEAN market rather than an external partner. So far, there are already signs that the main beneficiary of trade and investment redirection is Vietnam, followed by Malaysia and possibly Thailand. Therefore, the trade war may end up consolidating intra-ASEAN trade relations as the supply chain adjusts following investment diversion. There may also be an opportunity for the other newest ASEAN member states to play a greater role in cementing and expanding regional supply chain moving forward or going forward. So there's a hint of this possibility in the report itself. And let me offer you three thoughts in terms of why I think this hypothesis can materialize into reality and be the driving force or one of the driving force towards greater intra-ASEAN trade and investment. Firstly, investments coming from China, and this would be companies, Chinese companies, would want to come in to set up operations in ASEAN countries, not just to export to the United States, for example, to take advantage of the lower tariffs that we have here in ASEAN, but also to export to other ASEAN countries as these companies sees the ASEAN market as a legitimate and also important market in its own right, with more than 650 million people, a 2.4 trillion economy among the, when we combine the GDP of all the 10 member countries. So this is one possibility, and I think many Chinese companies, when they come and set up here in Malaysia, they not only want to, of course, export to the US, to Europe, but they are also looking at the ASEAN market as a very important market to them. So this would also increase the level of intra-ASEAN trade. The second point I want to highlight in relation to this hypothesis is that ASEAN may be a more suitable, a more palatable destination or area for US and Chinese companies to build interrelated supply chains as part of their global value chain. Why do I say this? I think it may be increasingly difficult for US companies to justify direct investments in a large scale into China that involves close cooperation with Chinese companies in China itself. But because of the growing ASEAN economy and because ASEAN is seen as a much more neutral area for both US and Chinese companies to come in to invest, this may be an area where US and Chinese companies can work together as part of their supply chain. So for example, US and China companies may look into the solar manufacturing sector. And I know of one particular case here in Malaysia whereby a US company that is mostly export-oriented relies on supplies of its solar glass from a Chinese company with operations here in Malaysia. And these supply chains are looking to expand into other ASEAN countries, including in Vietnam, which has been identified as one of the main beneficiaries in terms of trade and investment flows in ASEAN arising from the US-China conflict. So this, I think, could be one area of possible increase in ASEAN integration as US and Chinese companies build their global supply chains and global value chains within ASEAN countries. And the third reason why I think there could be more ASEAN integration and more trade flows and investment flows within ASEAN is the Belt and Road Initiative. As the Belt and Road Initiative goes to different ASEAN countries, firstly from an infrastructure perspective, but then later on as a catalyst for other types of investments from state-owned enterprises as well as from privately owned enterprises. There would be supply chains that would be built firstly among Chinese companies operating in the region, and then also as part of their vendor development programs or as part of their localization of their supply chain, whereby you can see, let's say, Malaysian companies that supply initially to local Chinese investors here in Malaysia, and then as they are comfortable with the standards of these Chinese companies, they may be looking to expand their exports to other Chinese companies that are operating in the region as well. Right, so these are speculative thoughts, and I think this would be interesting research area in ASEAN for many, many years to come as the level of investment and trade diversion increases as a result of the US-China conflict. So although it's something that we do not want to see long-term, but within the context of ASEAN, as these two giants fight, there's not much that we can do about it in terms of trying to resolve that matter. The higher powers that be have to speak to one another. But for us, what we can do is to see whether we can find ways in which we can maximize the potential benefits that can come to Malaysia and that also come to ASEAN. So with that, I'd like to thank you once again for inviting me, and also congratulations to Ideas for your research initiatives, which I'm sure will continue along the way, not just here in Malaysia, but also other countries in ASEAN. Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you, Ivy, for your speech, and thank you for staying on stage. Now, without further delay, I would like to invite Dr. Jayan Menon and IDEA's CEO, Ali Salman, on stage to launch Dr. Jayan's book entitled An Evolving ASEAN Vision and Reality. Next, it's my honor to invite Lawrence Todd, Azam Wan Hashim, and Aiman Wan Alias, all from Ideas, onto the stage for the release of the ASEAN Integration Report 2019. Okay. Lastly, I would like to invite Philip Stevens, Senior Fellow at Ideas, as well as the Director of Geneva Network, for the publication entitled The Importance of Intellectual Property Rights for Progress, a Reform Agenda for ASEAN Countries. Thank you. Thank you, Ivy, for your speech and for your attendance. All right. Now, on to our main event we've all been waiting for. Our first panel discussion follows the presentation by Dr. Jayan previously. But before that, I would like to just put out a kind reminder to all of you that the floor, of course, will be open to questions. In fact, we do encourage them. You can go onto the QR code on the agenda paper, or go to Slido and key in the code #V271. Please do put in your question. We'd be encouraged to enjoy the discussion later on. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Tham Siew Yen, Senior Fellow from the ICAS Yusof Ishak Institute, Bun Negara, Senior Fellow from the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Encik Muhammad Zahid Abdullah, Senior Director from the Ministry of International Trade and Industries Malaysia, as well as Dr. Jayant himself, who will moderate this discussion.
Thank you, MC. So before we get started with this session, let me welcome the panelists. I think we are missing one. Have we got everyone here? Oh, okay. He's on his way here. So Mr. Bun Negara will be here in a second. But you've already met the panelists, Dr. Tham Siew Yen, and also Mr. Zahid Abdullah from MITI. I want this to be a free-flowing discussion, not too many constraints or restrictions. But what I thought would be useful is to have a few general questions that I would like to suggest that the panelists consider in their remarks, and these questions relate mostly to the book on the evolving ASEAN that I presented, but I would also like to ensure that we discuss the ASEAN Economic Community Assessment, or the API Integration Report as well, in our panel discussion later on. But let me just go through these questions very quickly with you so that you know what some of the issues that we'll discuss. Firstly, I think it is useful to get the panelists to tell us how they see ASEAN's performance, generally speaking, in terms of whether, in fact, it's realized its original vision, and how is it evolving to face the key challenges going forward. What are the pluses and minuses? Secondly, I think I'd like to invite the panelists to consider whether ASEAN has indeed got the balance right between economic, strategic, security, and politics, and whether this needs to change going forward, especially given the turbulent times that we live in with rising uncertainties. Next, I want to try and place the whole ASEAN project and the ASEAN Economic Community in particular in broader regional and global context. So we have, ASEAN is not the only game in town, we have a lot of other things going on. So how do some of these things affect ASEAN and its AEC? How will RCEP, or the revived CPTPP, affect ASEAN and its future? Will it strengthen or dilute its role and function, right? We hear a lot about ASEAN centrality, right? Will this actually be preserved going forward? Will ASEAN be more or less relevant in 10 years' time? So I'll ask the panelists to look into their crystal balls, tell us what they think. In fact, why not consider the very future existence of ASEAN? Will we still need an ASEAN 50 years from now, right? In ADB, we often say that our sign of success is to put ourselves out of business, right? So we're no longer needed to help the poorest countries with their development. But of course, that never happens. We find new reasons to survive, just as the IMF and World Bank have done the same. But how will it be with ASEAN? Now, finally, what does the private sector want from ASEAN? And again, here, I want to try and draw the link back to the first report that was launched, the integration assessment. ASEAN economic integration will only really matter if the private sector gets engaged in taking it up and through investment and trade. And so I'd like to hear from the panelists what they think the private sector would want from ASEAN, and is it getting what it wants? Okay. Now, with all of this, I would also invite you to send your questions in through the app that was already described to you. I will pick up on your questions and present them to the panelists to get their responses. So please send them through as we go along. We really want this to be an interactive Q&A session. So with that, let me start by inviting Dr. Tham Siew Yen to make her opening statement, and Siew Yen will also use a PowerPoint presentation. So over to you, Siew Yen.
Yeah, I'll just, thank you very much, Dr. Menon. I'll just run through very quickly some of my initial thoughts on this. I have put a very short PowerPoint up on some of my initial thoughts. Okay, on the idea as to how ASEAN has performed, if we compare between the AEC 2015 and the AEC 2025 vision, we can see that it's actually similar. Well, the 4 pillars that we have in the AEC 2015, you can map it over to the AEC 2025 vision. And the part on the enhanced sectoral integration and cooperation actually comes out from the ASEAN priority integration sectors in the 2015 vision. So when we do this mapping, it would indicate that it would indicate that the AEC is very much a work in progress, and a lot of what AEC aspired to achieve in 2015 has not yet been achieved, and therefore it has continued into the 2025 vision. So in terms of the vision statement, they are similar and shows that we still have to do a lot of work to achieve the initial AEC 2015 goals. Next, please. If we look deeper into the AEC 2025, the idea of an economic community remains more or less the same. We have not moved forward in terms of wanting to achieve, for example, a customs union. We have no additions in terms of difficult issues like government procurement, movement of unskilled labor. So the core issues remain the same, and the focus is actually on implementing what has not been completed in the AEC 2015 vision. Next, please. And that's because within ASEAN, we have a lot of challenges in terms of the diversity. Next, please. So we have greatly 10 different countries which are at different stages of development and have different capabilities, and therefore the implementation process is more difficult for some than the others. So there are a lot of outstanding issues. Now, next please. I would like to discuss what I think is very important for the current scenario, which is the uncertainty in global conditions because of the trade war, and what ASEAN aspires to do in terms of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. It's important for ASEAN to be able to consolidate in the bigger region for global ASEAN, and for the fact that, as Dr. Menon has mentioned earlier, that the need for ASEAN to, in the integration report, the need for ASEAN to participate in global value chains. So the global ASEAN goal and the RCEP goal becomes very important. And the fact that RCEP is really, really big, a big potential block compared to the DPP-11 in terms of size, population, and trade, because India and China are in it. Next. So we have, at this point in time, which Inche Zahid can tell us about the progress of what has been achieved. We have the 18 chapters. Next. And what has been achieved up to last year was the 7 chapters. And the deadline is supposed to be, for the completion of this negotiation, is supposed to be at the end of this year. It makes a lot of difference if we can meet the target, if we can have the wider ASEAN bloc, but it remains to be seen as to whether this can be achieved by the end of the year. I think that this is with regards to Dr. Menon's question, whether if we achieve RCEP, does it mean ASEAN will become less relevant, will not be necessary 50 years from now? As I understand, ASEAN is the core for the RCEP because it's neutral. And it's a balancing factor against all the big powers that we have in RCEP. Balances between India, balances between China, and the mistrust that we have between China, Japan, Korea. So ASEAN is there as a stabilizing factor. So should the agreement be completed, does it mean that ASEAN will no longer be relevant? I don't think so, because agreements, my conjecture at this point in time is that the RCEP agreement will not be a very high-level agreement, and this is a conjecture from someone outside the negotiating table. And I think that if it's completed, the agreement may need to be upgraded over time, and therefore the balancing factor for ASEAN will still be needed in terms of be able to balance the interests of the other big countries in the bloc. So in going forward, in moving forward, I think more than ever before, the ASEAN needs to hang together, because we are facing very difficult, challenging times in the external environment. And in these challenging times, there are both opportunities and threats. So if ASEAN is able to move forward together, we can seize the fruits of the difficult times. But if ASEAN should fall apart, then I think each country in ASEAN will suffer even more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Siu Yen. Now I'll call on Mr. Zahid from MITI to give us his opening remarks. If you can do so for about 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jayan. Firstly, thank you for inviting me, even though it's a very last-minute call. But I will try my best to deliver something substantive here, and also try to answer relevant questions afterward. Okay, actually a lot of things, substance have been already discussed just now by the Deputy Minister, by Mr. Azam, and by you also, and by Dr. Tam. What I intend to do is just to highlight a few things, just to add on what has been already discussed just now. For example, if you talk about ASEAN integration, of course, the core of the so-called integrations is on the trade in goods, services, investments, as well as the movement of, they call it movement of natural person. This is for movement of business people. If you see the difference between the previous AEC 2015 and 2025, it's just a matter of strengthening the blueprint from 2015 to 2025 in terms of new elements in the AEC 2025. For example, if you see more focus will be given to, apart from the trade aspect just now, new elements such as e-commerce, even though there's some element of e-commerce in the previous AEC, but in the new 2025 AEC, the element has been somewhat improved, given more emphasis. And other elements such as Industry 4.0 is already being taken on board in the new AEC 2025. And a few more elements such as the global value chain is also there, and also the good regulatory practices is also in the new AEC. These are some new elements that being taken on board in the new AEC 2025. I would just like to reiterate what Dr. Ong mentioned just now on NTMs, non-tariff barriers. If you see, in terms of integrations in goods, services, investment is almost done in the blueprint. But the other important aspect is that the trade facilitation part, trying to address non-tariff barriers, non-tariff measures in doing business within ASEAN region. And those are things that we need to further giving more emphasis, so that we can improve trade within ASEAN. That leads me to the other point, which is the intra-ASEAN trade. If you see, intra-ASEAN trade is only around 23%, more or less 23%, the intra-ASEAN trade. So if you compare this to other regional bloc, for example, NAFTA, the EU, their portions of intra-trade is much, much higher. I would say more than 50%. So these are things that we can give more emphasis in the 2025 AEC. In terms of trade, intra-ASEAN trade, 23% is among ASEAN countries. But if you add on the 6 dialogue partners, the CJK, India, New Zealand, and also Australia, the trade within these 16 member countries is around 60%. Meaning to say the remaining 40% is with the rest of the world. Yeah? That's why these dialogue partners are very important for us also, for ASEAN. apart from the ASEAN member states. Okay, this is some questions that you asked us to consider. This is very tough questions. I'm not sure whether I can provide some answers here, but since RCEP, CPTP is being mentioned here, I would like to clarify. For this RCEP, CPP, TPP, there are special teams in MITI who handle these negotiations, and unfortunately, I'm not in the team. But I can just give you some general status of the negotiations. For example, Professor Tam just now has already mentioned about the progress of the negotiations. Of course, for RCEP, if possible, we want to conclude by end of this year. And if you notice, the intensity of negotiations is very intense now. In fact, now they are negotiating the RCEP, the RCEP now. In terms of the relevant, of course, these regional FTAs, including RCEPs, CPTPP, they are complement to whatever ASEAN has been doing at the moment. Of course, if you see for AEC 2015, for example, one of the characteristics is that we want ASEAN to be global ASEAN. So this is part of the initiative that ASEAN should go, should embrace. RCEP, for example, these are complementary to whatever ASEAN has done until now. So I think, Dr. Jayan, that's my opening for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zaid. Now let me turn to Mr. Pun Nagara from ISIS for his opening statement. About 7 minutes, please.
Thank you. If I do go over 7 minutes, please let me know, because I don't have the time with me, obviously. I'll just begin with a consideration of the questions to consider briefly, and then I'll go into some of the background that may help to explain some of the answers I provide. Firstly, how do you assess ASEAN's performance? I think basically it is the performance is as good as ASEAN countries can make it, given the vast differences between them, not just in terms of economic levels of economic development, but also of culture and histories, as well as their colonial legacies, quite different. Has it realized its original vision? Obviously not. Because ASEAN has a long way to go at whichever point of development of ASEAN we wish to take. The very fact that ASEAN has come up with 3 pillars of the community, aspects of the ASEAN community to aspire to, shows that this is so much more that ASEAN has to achieve. Is it evolving to face key challenges adequately? Well, ASEAN has always been evolving. And it always evolves to fit whatever conditions it faces, and also to satisfy the needs of ASEAN at any one time. As for whether ASEAN has got the balance right between economic, strategic, and security, well, it's always a matter of constant adjustment, because you never get the perfect combination, especially when global circumstances change, whether it's economic, strategic, security, political, or whichever. So ASEAN has always had to adapt, and its adaptability is its strength. This adaptability, the quality of adaptability, is often referred to in ASEAN speak as resilience. ASEAN resilience is what keeps it going, what keeps it there, and which will take it to the future. How will RCEP, CPTPP, and so on affect ASEAN in its future? Will it strengthen or dilute its role and function? Well, it depends. I think RCEP is fundamentally different from CPTPP, not just in terms of membership, but significantly because it includes all members of ASEAN, whereas CPTPP does not. And because CPTPP does not, whether or not and how, if it does affect ASEAN, depends on whether CPTPP is significant and effective or it is not so significant and effective. If it is significant and effective, then it is likely to divide ASEAN between members and non-members of CPTPP. At a time when we are still trying very hard to build an ASEAN economic community, when we have haves and have-nots among members, that's likely to lead to a division. And that's not going to be good for ASEAN unity, nor is it going to be good for ASEAN centrality in relating to countries outside ASEAN. Whether to strengthen or dilute its role, well, we'll have to see. As far as RCEP goes, if ASEAN can hold a line in dealing with bigger countries within RCEP, then I think ASEAN is likely to grow stronger. There will be an impetus for uniting countries within ASEAN in order to preserve and extend ASEAN centrality. And I think ASEAN really has no choice but to do that in order to protect its own interests and the interests of its members. Will ASEAN be more or less relevant 10 years from now? I think, of course, this is speculation. We don't really know. We are not professional fortune tellers, at least I'm not. I suspect it is likely to grow more relevant, probably because of what is happening now in the larger Asia-Pacific region, some would prefer to call Indo-Pacific, and that is the growing interest of major powers in this region. It's not just China and the US, but also Russia, India, the EU, even Britain if it comes after Brexit, as well as South Korea, Taiwan, and so on. Australia also, although it has not quite stated that officially, because of the problems that Trump USA is bringing up to the Western Alliance. And will ASEAN still matter 50 years from now? I hope so, and I think it will be. In fact, I suspect it will not only matter 50 years from now, but it is likely to be even more important, precisely because of the issues I mentioned earlier, the growing interest and involvement of major powers in this region. ASEAN member countries are, above all, very jealous of their national sovereignty, and in order to preserve their individual respective national sovereignties, they realize that in coming together in ASEAN, ASEAN is the best guarantor of that. Because on their own, they're likely to face more problems from the bigger countries, East and West. And what does the private sector want from ASEAN? Well, to me, private sector is not just the corporate sector. It also involves civil society groups, non-governmental groups, professionals, professional associations, and so on. And I think basically what they want in common is to have ASEAN as a more cohesive whole so that they can be more unified across the ASEAN region in terms of protecting and extending their common interests, whether it's in the legal fraternity, in business, in the medical fraternity, and so on. There is a lot that neighboring countries in ASEAN can do in order to enlarge and advance as well as to secure their interest in a world that is becoming globalized, has become, in fact, rapidly a globalized world. So very briefly, it's about protecting individual and national interests within the larger collectivity known as ASEAN. And that makes ASEAN the most viable and effective instrument for doing that for member countries. Now, just a bit of background, if I may. Probably the best way to misunderstand ASEAN is to listen to ASEAN official statements. It's said ever since the establishment of ASEAN back in 1967, that ASEAN is there to further the common cultural and economic interest of member nations. Well, not quite. That's the official line, but ASEAN is there mainly for political and security reasons. But then the common assumption tends to be that because of the Cold War, ASEAN has come together as a region of non-communist countries and so on. Again, no. Political and security in terms mainly of the kinds of challenges or even threats sometimes faced by ASEAN member countries from other ASEAN countries. And that is because of the problems we had over borders, territories, disputed claims on land or sea territory until today. And that's one of the reasons why ASEAN countries cannot form a common ASEAN security force. Regardless of the need for it in this region, we cannot do that because territorial and nationalistic claims, when they are in dispute, continue to be in dispute, don't work very well with a common security force because security is still ultimately national security for ASEAN member countries. And as a result, ASEAN will continue, I think, principally because every ASEAN member country needs ASEAN in order to protect and safeguard its own national interests in terms of confidence building, as well as building constantly, but also gradually, a community of more like-minded states over a long period of time, which also explains why ASEAN works slowly. It's an organic structure that has to grow. It is not something that can be created overnight with a contract. It doesn't work that way. And ASEAN itself, if you look at the communist threat facing ASEAN countries in the decades before, every single communist-inspired or communist-backed insurgency has been a domestic insurgency. They had little or no integration or coordination among the different ASEAN countries. Everyone was a homegrown insurgency, and they had little or nothing to do with the Cold War. Remember that since the late 1950s and officially expressed in the early 1960s, the Cold War was essentially between the US and the Soviet Union. China opted out, so it's following the Sino-Soviet split at that time. And Maoist China at the time saw itself as a third world country that was quite distant from the Cold War of the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. And in this region, although the domestic insurgencies were inspired by China, and China provided very little support, mainly in terms of morale or moral support, rather than material or other forms of assistance. It was actually only Vietnam that had links with the Soviet Union. No other country in this region had that Cold War link with the other side. But Thailand itself in particular felt very vulnerable. Not only was it the southern tip, well, it considered itself at the southern tip of mainland Southeast Asia, but because of the sizable ethnic Chinese community in Thailand, that Thai authorities were unsure of their allegiance to the nation or to China. Although that applies, or applied at the time to several other ASEAN countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, it was particularly felt in Thailand because of its proximity to the CLMV countries. And also, the year 1975 is pivotal because in that same year, at least three significant things happened. The Pathet Lao won power in Laos, and also the Viet Minh made advances in Vietnam, and the Vietnam War ended, and signaling pullback of US forces. And Thailand felt that it really needed to be an ally of the United States. Now the thing is, this region, Southeast Asia, has seen several regional organizations come and go, but ASEAN has been the only one that remains. To name a few, there was ASA, as the Association of Southeast Asia, consisting of only 3 countries, but it didn't last very long. So it ended, and we say putus asa. There was a loss of interest. There was also Mafilindo, also involving 3 countries: the Malaya, Philippines, Indonesia coming together. Mafilindo. It seemed to go on for a while, or was about to, but it lasted all of 1 month, because Malaya at the time, on the way to becoming Malaysia, felt that it was really an underhand way by Philippines and Indonesia to disrupt the formation of Malaysia. Because Indonesia was against Malaysia, as you know, and Sukarno, very soon after Mafilindo launched his confrontation campaign against Malaysia. The Philippines continues to have a claim on Sabah, and so on. So it was a time of great instability and doubt. And Malaysia opted out very quickly. Mafilindo was dead. And of course, the Cold War instrument at the time in this region was SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which was really a misnomer. Out of about 8 member countries, only 2 were from Southeast Asia, Thailand and the Philippines, because they were US allies. The others, principally Indonesia and Malaysia, who later became the key members of ASEAN, did not want to be part of SEATO because it was a Cold War instrument and we were non-aligned countries. So until today, ASEAN remains and has remained more than half a century. And I think because of that, it is likely to stay for at least another half century. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Negara. I really enjoyed the intervention, that quick, sort of journey through history as well, leading up to where we are today. We have a lot of questions coming through, so please keep them coming. But I noticed quite a few actually on this regional and global context, right? Okay, so you got, should Malaysia ratify the CPTPP? Which is more important, CPTPP or ASEAN? And how will one affect the other? Or is RCEP more important, RCEP or CPTPP? So we got a bunch of questions here about the changing architecture around ASEAN, whether Malaysia should get, which one Malaysia should prefer, which one they should go ahead with. And also, I just tag on a few questions here relating to OBOR, which is no longer OBOR, it's Belt and Road Initiative of China, headed by China. According to one questioner, YB Ong Kian Min implied that ASEAN must be viewed through the OBOR prism. Do you agree with that if we are to move forward? So a few questions on the changing architecture. I'll invite comments from, I think, all our panelists, starting with you, Dr. Suyen.
If you look at the membership of the RCEP and the CPTPP, they are quite different. Therefore, the choice should not be either or. I think the choice for moving forward for Malaysia, and I feel this very strongly because Malaysia is a small open economy without a large domestic market. Therefore, for our firms, and I speak from the point of view of the SMEs, for the SMEs to become competitive and cost competitive, they have to grow beyond the domestic market, because it is only when you export and you are able to produce for a larger market that we can reap economies of scale. So if SMEs can produce and sell to the larger market, which for Malaysia, the larger market, the immediate market should be ASEAN, because in trade, distance matters in terms of trade costs, in terms of transaction costs. So why sell to Latin America when you have ASEAN? Therefore, for the Malaysian SMEs, if they make an effort to export and to penetrate the export market in ASEAN, they would be able to reap economies of scale. Therefore, I support ASEAN endeavors, such as the RCEP, which is to enlarge the market for our small entrepreneurs. And I also support the CPTPP because the market reach is different. And because the two regional groupings have different chapters in the agreement, you know. RCEP has only 18, CPTPP has 30 chapters, and the regulations are different, the reach is different. Both groupings would require, I think, for it to be this partner, that Boon said, to be significant and effective. I like that. Not just being a member of the agreement, but to make the agreement work for you, for it to be significant and effective, is that we have to undergo domestic reforms. I go back to the argument that Dr. Menon made in his opening remarks that the low-hanging fruits are all over. For us, for ASEAN to move forward, we have to do the difficult part. And the difficult part is actually domestic reforms, because if we look at all the difficulties that firms have in terms of penetrating the ASEAN markets, non-tariff measures, for example. Non-tariff measures have to do with standards and standards compliance, and these impose huge costs for exporters. So the domestic reforms do not mean just regulatory changes. A lot of it means that you have to change your processes, because that which imposes huge costs for the firms are actually compliance costs. Compliance costs to the processes that you have in the country towards the standards that you want. So therefore, if we want ASEAN to move forward and for Malaysia to move forward, what we need is actually domestic reform, reforming towards good governance, good regulatory practices, reducing unnecessary regulations and reducing unnecessary processes. So these kind of groupings, such as the CPTPP, for example, will require us to look through our labor laws, to do away with the unnecessary regulations. And it's a way of moving forward for me. Therefore, both agreements are equally good for Malaysia.
Thank you. Mr. Khalid?
If I can just add to what Professor Tam has mentioned. In terms of policy, of course, Malaysia being a small country, we depends a lot on trade, international trading with other countries. That's why one of our policy is to pursue trade liberalizations, but through a WTO platform, through regulations and rule. That's why if you see people mentioning about RCEP, CPTPP, of course we are one of the countries in RCEP, also CPTPPs, but before we embark on negotiating these two FTAs, we have done the so-called cost and benefits analysis. If you find it's more beneficial for us to take part in the negotiations, that's why we will take part. That's why we are involved in RCEPs and also CPTPP. Since the negotiation is still ongoing, I will not touch more details on that, but what I want to say here is that if the FTAs, regardless of not necessarily RCEPs or CPTPP, but any FTAs, it will benefit our people, our businesses. Of course, we will sign and we will ratify. People say about ASEAN just now. Of course, ASEAN is quite limited. Now our FTAs is more on, in terms of goods, we are relying more on AFTA. And if you see, in terms of tariff liberations in ASEAN, in AFTA, overall is already around 98% zero tariff among ASEAN countries. For Malaysia, is already 99%. For the four countries, CLNV is around 98%. That's why if average is around, 97%. That's why if you average for the whole 10 ASEAN member states, it's around 98%. That's why we need these FTAs so that we can expand, like Prof. Tam mentioned just now, we can expand our market overseas. But of course, we need to justify the benefits that will accrue to ASEAN or to Malaysia specifically. I think that's all my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zaid. Mr. Nagar?
Well, I have to go back to ASEAN to say that it is fundamentally a different organization from all the others we are talking about here, whether it's RCEP, CPTPP, or anything else, because ASEAN covers everything in every field. It's not just economics or anything, and it's really the key, the sole, the master organization in Southeast Asia. There's nothing like it before, and nothing like it now. Probably nothing like it in the future. And ASEAN is possible, and it's been there for more than half a century, as I said. It's possible, and it's possibly going to last a long time, as it has already lasted, because it has hidden strengths which are seldom, if ever, recognized. For example, it has a way of working that seems imperceptible to many people. There are very few textbooks on ASEAN, and where there are any at all, I think they hardly scratch the surface of, telling people how to understand ASEAN. Because the way ASEAN works is, I think, is a mystery to many people, including many people in ASEAN countries. And basically, it is this, going back to the term resilience as a strength in ASEAN, a factor. Through this resilience of working, which is basically to protect its own interest and the interest of its member countries, ASEAN will not really accept but develop whatever institution or idea that is good for it. Whatever works for ASEAN and is to ASEAN's benefit, that will flourish, as far as ASEAN is concerned. But whatever organization or concept that does not work for ASEAN or works against the interests of ASEAN will be sidelined by ASEAN.
Can I tag on a question to that? Because the second most trending question right now is exactly what you were referring to, in a sense. And that is, do you see ASEAN's non-interference principle as a primary obstacle to create a single market, as the institutional interest is higher than economic interest? So does ASEAN need to change, and in particular in relation to one of its defining sort of principles, which is non-interference, if it's going to pursue greater economic integration?
Well, actually, this is one of the examples of a common misunderstanding of ASEAN, and that is, the non-interference principle is unique to ASEAN, which it is not. Non-interference among member countries of the UN is right there in the UN Charter. This UN
does
principle.
it have to get rid of it, is the question?
No, I mean, then the UN has to get rid of it. It is common to all UN countries in the UN Charter itself that you do not interfere. The only countries that interfere are superpowers that invade other countries. I mean, what else? How else do you interfere?
Okay, so let me try and interpret what I think the questioner is asking. It's not my question, but I think, okay, look at the EU. They do give up some sovereignty, and there is some common sort of positions that need to be taken, which will affect national policies, conditions. How far can ASEAN go about in giving up sovereignty, let's say, in terms of pursuing its economic objectives? Perhaps that's what's being asked.
Okay, I get your point. Again, a common misunderstanding here as well, so if I may say so. ASEAN is not like the EU and was never intended to be. The EU hopes to become a super state, continental-wide super state. ASEAN never imagined becoming something like that, and it's not going to become something like that.
Degree, though, how far? It'll never become the EU, doesn't want to be the EU. How close do you think it needs to get while still preserving its identity and allowing greater economic integration? What's the trade-off?
The most accurate answer I can find is that ASEAN will go as far as it needs to by member countries, And as usual, according to the lowest common denominator, to which the country which is least comfortable with it is most comfortable with. I think that is the level we can define. Again, very normative, I know. It's not very, in terms of hard facts and figures or data, because it is something indefinable. That's ASEAN. That's been the ASEAN characteristic all along, and it will remain so, because it is a very intuitive way of working. It's not set up set down in black and white, because ASEAN countries are not comfortable with that. They need a degree of flexibility, which relates to resilience, as I said. So there's room for maneuver and adjustment. And that's how ASEAN countries get together. But to go back to the point about non-interference, I think the term interference as well as non-interference have been too rigidly defined by everybody. I think there has been a degree of intervention among ASEAN countries. It's just that ASEAN does not recognize it as such. Officially, it does not happen, but there is a form of pressure, when necessary, on certain erring countries, that may be a problem to the rest, and it happens. It's just that it's not called interference in ASEAN speak. And ASEAN gets away with not having to interfere and does not do so in its own perception.
Sure, thank you. No, I think you've answered the almost impossible to answer question quite well. There's another question here, and I'll just open this up to panelists. Don't feel obliged to answer, but if you want to jump in. Should ASEAN consider more of a multi-track approach, given the huge gap between BCLM and the rest? Who would like to try and answer that? Everyone's looking at you, Suyen.
I don't. Okay, let me interpret the multi-track approach to mean that you have. I would interpret it that you mean to have different implementation periods for the more developed and the less developed, which ASEAN has, for example, in the tariffs, the CEPT.
Is there enough special and differential treatment, let's say?
There is already
Is
special.
there enough? Is there enough? Sorry, I'm going to push you on the behalf of the questioner.
Is there enough special and differential?
The gaps, are they closing fast enough? That's another way.
In the challenges for ASEAN is that the development is different for the different countries, and they have big gaps between the countries. But I remember seeing this, Jay, that there have been studies that show actually the development gap is closing, not widening. Of course, there's still the gap. And ASEAN addresses this in one of its pillars, the inclusive development, in its promotion for SME development, in one of the pillars in the ASEAN 2025 for inclusive development, in promoting SME development, that apart from capacity development through the initiative for ASEAN integration, that we have the more developed ASEAN member countries helping the less developed ASEAN countries to develop capacity building through the IAA initiatives. We now have actually the SME development in recognition of the fact that SMEs are the bulk of the enterprises in all ASEAN countries. And therefore, building the capacity of SMEs is tantamount to a sort of bottoms-up approach towards closing the development gap. That if we can actually improve the capacity of the SMEs to access the ASEAN market, for example, we would be able to help each country to grow faster, develop, and to catch up in the development. So I would say that there are initiatives. As to your question, whether these are enough, ultimately depends on how well these initiatives are being implemented. I think my assessment is that there are initiatives, but of course, in ASEAN, the whole question is not about initiatives. The whole question is about how well these initiatives are being implemented. So, so it comes back to the question, are they being well implemented?
Okay, so there's a question, I think, which is really well suited to you, Mr. Zayed, and it says, how influential is Malaysia in ASEAN, particularly in pushing for economic integration and consensus building? And tagged to that is, I guess, the issue of, should Malaysia be playing a bigger role as a member of ASEAN, being one of the richer countries, and also whether will Mr. Jokowi play the leading role soon? So you don't have to answer the last one, but certainly the first one.
This is a tough one. If you see, Malaysia is one of the founding members of ASEAN, and we have been quite vocal at certain times. For example, our ministers, like YB, Dr. Ong mentioned just now, we are quite vocal in terms of NTM just now, non-tariff barriers, because we want to do trade with our ASEAN members, the other member states. But sometimes there are some obstacles that hinder trades, and one of them is NTMs that we are very vocal in. Actually, what ministers mentioned just now, Malaysia, we propose something in the ASEAN platform, and that's being adopted by the ASEAN member states. I think that's one of the more important one that Malaysia has played our role. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, quickly, because I have one more question for you.
Yes. Well, I think Malaysia has in the past played a very active role in ASEAN, and it depends on who makes up the leadership in the country. Under Tun Mahathir, Malaysia has always had a very active foreign policy role, including in ASEAN. And I think you can look forward to that pretty soon, because following the elections last year, the focus has initially been, of course, on domestic issues for obvious reasons. I think ASEAN has a special place in Malaysian foreign policy because not only in the first 5 original members, but even with ASEAN 6 when Brunei joined, Malaysia was the only country in ASEAN with borders with all the other member countries, either sea or land borders or both. With the entry of CLMV countries later on in ASEAN, then Malaysia was no longer the only country with borders with the others. But still, Malaysia retains its central position in ASEAN, geographically at least. And because a lot of the issues and challenges in ASEAN has been over bilateral issues and challenges, it does have a special importance for Malaysia. We talk about ASEAN centrality now, but Malaysian centrality in ASEAN has always been the case.
So we have about 7 minutes left, and I want to give everyone a minute and a bit to have their final concluding remarks. But one last question, and maybe we can start with you again, Mr. Nagara. Is YB on OKM right that the China trade war is good for ASEAN integration? Sorry, big question, but quick answers only, please.
I think not necessarily so, because even if you look at the benefits of the US-China trade war, and which are like the relocation of industries to Malaysia, for example, we are competing with other ASEAN countries for these factories and plants coming in. And in other ways, we are still competitors because we are more or less at the same level of development.
Mr. Zayed, do you have an official MITI position on the China trade war? We won't quote you in the press, at least.
There's no official statement, but of course, depends on situations. You see, Malaysia, we can take advantage of the trade war because we can provide our raw materials, our supply to US and also to China, for example. Once before this, US they import from China, but we can take advantage. We can export to China. The one to US, the one that China cannot export. Same thing to China. I think it depends on situations, but the more important one is that we can try to exploit whatever opportunities from the situation. Thank you.
Sian, do you have any comments very quickly?
I think that if the war prolongs, everybody will suffer because global growth will slow down. And we cannot be just depending on ASEAN alone for demand. We have to still think about demand. We still depend on US demand, China for demand. So should global growth slow down, or worse, we move into global recession, then everybody suffers. Even if your investment has relocated your supply chain, who are you supplying to? So that's the main question. I have one quick response to this question, which I think is not what YB meant. ASEAN should be viewed through the eyes of OBO. I don't think so. I think ASEAN is ASEAN. ASEAN looks to work together to tap on the BRI initiatives, but we do not look at ASEAN through OBO.
No, just on that point, I think we should also, in YB's absence, not here to defend himself, just reading out the questions. I don't think YB actually meant that the trade was good for ASEAN integration, but rather that it could increase intra-ASEAN trade by the changes taking place, the restructuring of the supply chain. So that's a different issue altogether, yeah. Okay, so we are about to finish, but I want to give everyone the opportunity to have a final word. We started with you, Siu-Yen, so maybe we'll start with Mr. Nagara. Just a couple of minutes, please.
Yes, underlining what I mentioned throughout is the implicit notion that, we may talk about economics and growth and development, but they are all supported by the stability and security in the region. And without ASEAN, we wouldn't have that in Southeast Asia. It is unimaginable what this region would be like today without ASEAN, especially if you're aware of the conflicts, disputes, and so on, some of which continue today, but which have been muffled or at least toned down because of ASEAN and the need for each ASEAN member country's larger interest in having good relations with its neighbors. Having said that, I have to mention also that ASEAN is not only an organization that is vied for by member countries that will remain. Unlike the EU, we do not have a Brexit of ASEAN. But in fact, other countries far away want to join ASEAN. Quite unimaginably, Turkey, for example, has been said to want to join ASEAN, Mongolia, even Sri Lanka. In fact, in the case of Sri Lanka, it has tried repeatedly to join ASEAN from the very day before ASEAN was formed even. Sri Lankan representatives, for information, were sitting outside the room when ASEAN leaders were inside trying to establish ASEAN. When the meeting was over and they came out, and the Sri Lankan representative said, well, the answer from one of the ASEAN leaders was quite diplomatic. I think years later, Sri Lanka continued to want to join ASEAN, and the reply given by the foreign minister of Indonesia at the time, I think, was a classic one. And he said, sorry, because ASEAN is an association of countries only where the durian grows naturally. And the durian does not grow naturally in Sri Lanka, so you cannot join ASEAN. Professor Mokhtar Kusumamaja made that famous line. It may sound frivolous, but it was a very diplomatic and effective way of putting across the idea that this was an association only for Southeast Asia.
It's in the title. Please, Suzanne.
Yeah, just to recap, ASEAN is just a platform where, they discuss rules and regulations that can facilitate trade. So in terms of the engine of growth is still the private sector. They will have to take this opportunity in ASEAN to improve trades and to improve intra-ASEAN trade. But of course, it depends on the attractiveness of the package being negotiated in ASEAN. And they have other platforms, not necessarily in ASEAN FTAs, but we have also +1 FTAs or Malaysian bilateral FTAs that they can try to maneuver, for example, not necessarily from ASEAN. But what I want to say is that it is just a platform for us to provide opportunities to the private sector to grow. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ed. And finally, Dr. Syria.
I think all the three pillars in ASEAN are important. The political, security, and the economic pillars work together in a virtuous cycle. Peace and stability, fostering prosperity, prosperity, fostering peace and stability. Social-cultural pillar, I think, is very important for cultivating the ASEAN we-ness, the we-ness that's missing in the ASEAN identity. So hopefully all three pillars work together for the good of ASEAN.
So one day we might talk among ourselves as ASEAN citizens as well, as the Europeans sometimes do. So I'm not going to try to summarize the many, many useful points made here today, but just to say I think that we all agree that ASEAN, for all its failings, has done a very good job, if nothing else, in preserving the peace and allowing economic prosperity throughout the region and to produce so many important improvements in the social condition of the citizens of ASEAN. So with that, and I think everyone agrees, it'll be here 50 years from now. Some of us can come back and talk again about it in 50 years, maybe at least 10 years from now. We could all reconvene to talk about what ASEAN has and hasn't achieved and whether it's actually more important than it has been so far. But please let me ask all of you to join me in thanking the panelists for a very interesting, lively discussion. Now I'll hand it over to the MC, who has good news about a coffee break, I think.
All right. Thank you, Doctor and esteemed panel members, for that very thought-provoking discussion. And just a quick photo op, perhaps. Can I invite everyone to move a bit forward so we have a quick photo session? All right, audiences, I think just to announce the good news also, please, to the side, we have some refreshments waiting for you, just to give us a break before we continue on to the next panel. Do help yourself. 15 minutes break.
It all started on June 28, 2016, when President Trump, during his campaign in Pennsylvania, laid out plans to counter Chinese trade practices. From September 1st of this year, after yet another round of tariffs on $300 billion of Chinese imports, the US has implemented a tariff levy on essentially every single Chinese good that it imports. Now, zooming in on the eastern part of the world, China's economic integration with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, has been growing. And this integration has been accelerating amidst the trade and political tensions with the US. Prior to the trade war, ASEAN's economic ties with China were already intense. which is evident in the free trade agreement between ASEAN and China. And also the fact that China is already the main trade partner for every single ASEAN country. The trade war has sped up a process that was already underway in the region, which is the relocation of lower value-added manufacturing activities from China into Southeast Asia. Attracted by the relatively lower wages from smaller ASEAN economies, the increasingly skilled workforce, and the natural resource abundance, Chinese firms have looked to its ASEAN partners to find a way around the negative effects of the trade war. Some ASEAN countries, such as Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand, have somewhat gained from the Chinese trade diversion and production-based relocation. As both China and US have tariffs on the other's products, some firms in ASEAN have experienced increasing demand from both Chinese and American firms who have diverted their trade to ASEAN countries to buy products tariff-free. In the longer term, some Chinese firms have relocated their production base to ASEAN countries in order to export into the US without having to face tariffs. It remains uncertain whether the Chinese influence in ASEAN, coupled with the US-China trade war, will lead to greater cooperation amongst the members to make a unified attempt to benefit from China's embrace, or whether it would cause more friction and competition between member states as they fight to be the favorite of their wealthy neighbor. That's why the US-China trade war has raised the stakes so high for ASEAN. Its economic coherence will be threatened by the world's two economic superpowers falling out. If countries begin to take sides in the trade war, either increasing trade with China or siding with the US, there isn't really anything that one set of ASEAN countries can do to prevent the other from taking sides in the trade war. Although a defection of one or a few ASEAN countries wouldn't spell the end of the regional cooperation, because in the process of evolving into a regional organization, the region has developed certain institutional capabilities in other non-economic areas, for example, political security and social culture. What the US-China trade war has done is put ASEAN in a position of competing interests, subverting away from the region's role as an internodal actor in global trade. Take that role away, and ASEAN would regress into a collection of states whose interactions are less than the sum of their parts. We'd like to thank the Frederick Naumann Foundation for helping us create this video series. These videos are part of our ASEAN Prosperity Initiative project, where we shed some light into the pertinent issues surrounding the region's integration. For more information on what IDEAS does and who we are, click the link in the description below.